Hello and welcome to the Artis Opus video. As I seem to be saying a lot at the moment, long requested, we are tackling Grey Knights. He turned out pretty well. You probably recognise that method from our recent Power Swords tutorial. Easy on a bigger model, actually. It didn't take that much more time, easy to do the masking, that type of thing. Really pleased with this. This tutorial is a comprehensive guide on approaching metallics, not just on a large scale, but any scale. Plenty of tips there that aren't, tied to this model. There is a large section in the middle where I go in depth on how to tech out your washes. If you don't want to watch that, just feel free to skip it. The timestamps are in there for your own convenience. However, if you want some thorough tips on, how to mix washes, what putting contrast into your washes will do and stuff like that, then by all means check it out. At some point in the future, I will do a ultimate guide to washes video. I've decided that during the process of this. I think there's definitely some good education we can give. One other touchstone, if you like the base, check out Dan Osborne on Instagram. He's got loads of quick, amazing little how-to step-by-step guides. Copy that entirely. Really pleased with the end result of that. Anyway, that is it. Let's jump into the video. What are we painting our baby beyond with? Well, I've got a couple of paints here, just want to cover them briefly. These cover amazingly. This is my TM mix. Any regulars to the channel will know that. If you do not have Vallejo Game Air Silver or a silver that is this bright, just drop out the black. I'll be using the black to make sure that the base coats of this at least aren't too bright. If you do not have Huldra Blue from Scale 75 Fantasy and Games range, take the deepest blue that you do have and put a little bit of blue ink or blue contrast into it. Now I am aware that there is a Grey Knights coloured metallic. I don't want to use that, I want to use these because I like how they work and I think they're really flexible and wonderful to use, so let's rock on. So I am absolutely going to be using the extra large for this. Any excuse I've got is good on. This one has a black tip because I reserve different brushes for metallics. You don't have to do that, but it just speeds things up and it can help avoid contamination. If you are using the same brush, just make sure to clean it between sessions. Now, we're base coating on a large model here. I get a lot of questions about this in terms of I am having issues, why does yours look smoother than mine, etc. We are going to be using a more dilute base coat than I think people realize we use, and how we do that is from the dampening pad. My brush is wetter than it would be normally. It's not wet, but it has been thoroughly dampened. This coat is going everywhere and it's going to cover beautifully pretty much in one coat. So it's going all over the model. Now what you can do is you can kind of buff and dry brush this, and because it's got such extreme coverage, hopefully you can see that it is ridiculous. I hope that's showing up on camera. I imagine it is, because it's impossible to not see something this extreme. What you can do is you can pretty much dry brush it, and because it will just coat anything it touches, you don't need to be obsessive about the nooks and crannies. They're going to be darker anyway. Do by all means try and get in there, but your model can look absolutely fine if you just give it one coat coverage with this type of mix. You can add in more blue if you want to push the Grey Knights feel. So I'll show you how that would look. Still take some of the silver. You can also start brighter. This is close to the Games Workshop color here. Now, what I've got on my palette, let me show it on a different section. There you go. So you just have a slightly more icy blue. You can absolutely do that if you like, all down to personal preference. We are going to be washing this stuff anyway. So I'm going to coat mine completely like this, top to bottom. You probably saw there that I jumped all the way from an XL to a small. This is a particularly old battered small. It's actually a pre-branding. This is an Alva test batch one, which is why it's looking a little bit forlorn. You will have also noticed some patches appearing around the edge of my palette on my blotting paper. Now, these are pretty potent paints. You're going to end up using them wetter, even if it's just as a result of slightly wetter with a dampening pad. You're going to end up with more saturation in there and the paint will be pulled into the bristles more. So I always do stuff like this to just try and avoid excessive buildup. That is what ultimately will kill your brushes more than anything. Now, I think I've actually rushed my base coat a bit, and I think everyone is guilty of this. The moment you're using dry brushing, people think everything should be going at 100 miles an hour. Now, if you're base coating this by hand, it would take forever. By all means, do feel free to whack out a spray can. You can always just wash it more heavily in the stage that we're about to do now, or use an airbrush if you think that you'll end up rushing the base coat by hand. The place where it's the most evident, if I can specifically pull it out, is this shim pad where I've just put it on a bit thick basically, and then I've gone in there before it's dried properly and it's made it look a bit patchy. Whereas, you know, other areas where it's gone down super smoothly, this knee pad, we've got really nice quality of coverage. So yeah, don't rush it, there's no need. I mean, there's not much of a difference between 10 minutes and 13 minutes. So yeah, don't rush. Final note, I have made the guy slightly brighter and slightly bluer, just to see how that goes. We can always wash him a couple of times if you want to pull him back down. I wanted to take a minute to talk about washers, or washing, not specifically washers. Luckily they're not called washers anymore, they're called shades by GW terms. So here I have contrast Leviathan blue. This thing is nuts. Tell you what, let's do this on paper. Leviathan blue. Let's get a bit of each of these. I'm not going to wash my brush properly between scoops. You guys are going to have to deal with it. That's Leviathan blue. We have the shade, Drakenhof Nightshade. This is what they'll look like mixed. See what I did there? You guys can't tell me off now. And this is some Huldra blue. On my palette here, we have the contrast and we have the shade. This one's more vibrant, it's more colorful. That's just a matter of, you know, the colors that are in there. And then we've got this one here, which is a paint. Now, obviously this paint is going to go on forever and ever and ever, and these are going to stretch out more. This is going to be stronger because it's a contrast paint, and it's a strong contrast paint. That's, think of it more like an ink. And this is literally a wash. You know, it's made to be semi-transparent. We are trying to figure out what mix we want to put on our dude. So let's use the properties of these to help inform that. Now, I want something we can put all over. We don't want it to be super hardcore, but we do want to be able to pull it in the recesses and get the effects we want. If we find the right color and it's too strong, we can dilute it super easily because Lamy medium exists. So what I'm going to do here is probably end up taking a mix between these two and putting a little bit of Huldra blue in it. Now, I always do things like this, but I wanted to explain the thinking behind it. So let's take, first of all, while our brush is clean, because I wouldn't do this. So let's take some Lamy medium and pop it in here. I got quite a lot of medium in there. That's going to lead to something very milky. I'm then going to bulk it out with a softer one, which is Drakenhof Nightshade. Now this is, I say soft, it's just not got the coverage of the two other paints that we've got on our palette, but it is going to tint things blue. Now this is a kind of a blacky blue, and I want that for this. You know, I could be using some crazy pure blue and end up with these guys looking nuts bright, but that's not, in my mind, the real strength of doing grey notes. Just check how it is on the paper, that'll give us an impression. Now let's put a little bit of our contrast in. This is a slightly dull color, as I've said. I can bring it up using a bit of this one. Instantly. How does that look on paper now? So you see a bit more color going on there. I'm gonna put in a tiny bit more. Now, we could just stop here, absolutely, but what I want to do is I'm gonna be using Huldra blue throughout this paint job. So not because I'm unhappy with that, but because I want this to make sense in terms of coherency with the rest of the paint job. We're going to put a small dollop, that's obviously a technical term there, in there. Look, perfect. So hopefully this is going to show up nicely on the paper. You know, that is just a nicer color. You know, there isn't, I'm not going to put reasoning into that, but that color is absolutely win. We like that one. Wonderful. Okay, so that is what we're going for. Now we've done all of that work, let's see how it behaves on our model. We can absolutely dilute this further if we need. So I'm going to take a big scoop of water, clean out the palette next to it in case it's got fluff in it, and have that ready. And I'm going to pick a section of my model which either I don't care about or for other reasons isn't going to be an issue. So I'm going to pick something that I'm planning on being quite dark and has some obvious recesses. I'm using a size 5, by the way. Okay, so that is, always give it a blow. In the recesses, that is behaving about how I would want it to behave. I'm going to go to a large, so it looks like it's fairly okay. This isn't going to screw things up majorly. So now I can go to a larger panel and see how this is behaving. Now, I feel like I would like it to be physically a little bit more thick or more dark. So what are we going to do to get it to fix those properties and send it in the direction that we want? We've got some stronger colors. So here's a stronger color. Bigger scoop of this now. I'm actually going to put this sideways here because I think that was overly generous. and you can't reverse this stuff. It's very easy to add too much, and then you end up having to make, you know, like the world's largest wash batch. So I will take it bit by bit. You know, while we're doing this testing, let's make sure that we don't lead to any of the pooling that we do not want on our final model. Pull that away. This is okay around the rivets, I'm fine with that. And we're gonna absorb that. Okay, let's carefully go for his feet. That is better. I'm feeling okay with that now. These things tend to look really good on small hyper-textured sections, and where they're gonna get shown up is on larger sections. So, knee pad. How thick you put it on is really important, but you know, also how physically thick and viscous the actual bit is. I can see a little lump has appeared here, or has been highlighted. Just gonna get rid of that. Hopefully we can buff that out on that section a miniature later. Okay, so this is looking okay tint-wise. I think I am okay with that and its properties. I'll test it on one more large panel. Now, just because you have a big brush, it doesn't mean that you have to be, you know, heavy-handed or you can't be delicate. So I'm gonna put it all on, and then rather than just moving on to the next section, take some of that paint out. I'm gonna make sure that I'm completely happy with the amount of paint on this piece. Make sure you hit all of the piece, particularly the bits that you can't see that are around the corners. And then what I'm gonna do with this, see I've overspilled there, is I'm gonna drag it to the sections where I want it. And if there's any you know, large pooling in those sections where I don't want it, I will absorb that with a brush. Okay, I am about okay with that. Hopefully that's shown up fairly well on camera. We'll get to see on a different color background soon. I'm okay with this wash now. Now, I know that's a long process, but I wanted to take people into, I often do things on camera and people just accept them, which is wonderful, but I wanted to be able to arm you with, you know, the exact live process of me working out whether a wash is acceptable or not. And this one appears to be more than acceptable. So let's put it everywhere on our model. I have left this to dry. Now, leaving it to dry is important. I wanted to point out a couple of things. We've got some pooling here. These are taking a long time to dry because they're quite thick, and I actually went into this section here and absorbed out a bubble. This is what happens, you know, gravity is a thing and stuff will flow downwards. These little sections here that we've got where I've been a little bit heavy-handed and a bit thick, I'm gonna make sure that they're fully dry before I do anything further on them, because particularly with dry brushing, which is a physical painting method, we don't want to agitate those out now. The way to tell if they're dry is just whether they're shiny or not. So even though this was a thicker section on this kind of foot pad, you can see that's got a bit less of a sheen of it. This has got no sheen, and this has got quite a lot of sheen. That means that would be easily agitated. If I am like, let's show this in person. You can see I can even dimple that surface still with an X-Acto blade. So I'm going to give this a hairdry and carry on. Overall though, fairly successful. A couple of bits that were a little bit too overzealous. This is what happens more readily on larger sections. We are going to be covering a lot of this, like a lot. So don't worry too much. Even if something looks like a major mistake or, you know, is really unsightly, like this weird pooling we've got there, that's because I've changed angles and the liquid that was pooling here has seeped around the back, and that's left tidal marks, whereas it would have just dried in a lump like this one. Yeah, don't despair. We are going to be fixing all of this really nicely, and you know, there's always weathering if you do want to hide a section that went particularly wrong. So I'm going to make sure it's fully dry, and we're going to move on to the top. These hyper-textured sections should really readily wash extremely beautifully, and they're the areas where you'll probably have the least issues. Just make sure you don't have excessive pooling. You can absorb, you can put down, and you can take away with your brush. I find it's easier to not rush these sections. There's that assumption with a big flat area that you should give it a one coat. Treat it like you're painting a wall, which obviously, you know, isn't quite ideal. We're not painting any walls here. Another tip for putting down wash is, if they've gone down and you want them to be a little bit more uniform or unified, you can blow them, and it's a really nice gentle way of getting them, you know, coaxing them to the areas where they'd end up naturally, and you get them there a little bit faster, and then rather than them gradually seeping there and leaving streaking marks or anything like that, you kind of push them to that section. You can actually use your airbrush for this. You know, you can quickly coat an area, and before it started drying too much, go in there and give it a blow with the airbrush. I prefer it manual though, because you can do it while you're working. I'm going to take my own advice in mind in this one. I'm going to go slowly, and I'm going to go from this side of the model all the way around to this side, and each section I hit, I will make sure I've completed it from all angles. That's very easily done. You always forget the underneath or the far side where, you know, the bit that would have been in shadow if your face were casting light. So I'm going to go over really carefully, not rush this whatsoever, complete each section, and we'll see if I've got a noticeable difference in the quality of the coverage on top in comparison to the lower half. We have laid down our blue wash. Now, the emphasis on this wash was not to do something that was perfect. There are definitely some mistakes here. You'll see me, or you know, slips or pulling or whatever. You'll see me fixing those. I have left this to dry outdoors actually, because it's a warm day and the wind helps, for quite a while. So I am infinitely sure that these areas aren't going to get disturbed now, even the bits that are a bit shiny. One thing to bear in mind is if these are shiny in the recesses, that still means they're tacky. Make sure your dry brushes are clean, otherwise any old dusty bits that have collected in the bristles, they will go there, and then rather than being brushable off later, they might go onto something that's still drying. Let's grab a little bit of our silver, a little bit of our black. We're only going to need like a touch of this, I presume. So I'll put a long streak. Putting a long thin streak means that it's easier for me to take less, even with a big brush. Putting a blob means, you know, I don't have much choice at that. So if I wanted to be really careful with the black, I could properly string it out like this. And then of course, we're going to grab some of our Huldra. Now I'm not going to involve any of my wash colors in the mix. This is all we need. I have spent a fair bit of time padding my dampening pad with my finger. It's now at a lighter stage of moisture. That's important because what we needed for a base coat is very different to what we need for dry brushing here. So this is to only just about make the brush a tiny bit damp. That's all we're going for. We're not going for, you know, graphically moisturing it in any way. Another thing of note, I do not want this ending up too blue. So I'm quite happy to spend some time making sure we get this right. I'm going to take a tiny smidge of black, mix that into the entire thing, all of the brush, and that will be really helpful because what we're doing here is if we don't use this black at this stage, that means that whatever we do next, it's going to be all the more difficult to make it show up. Now what I'm going to do is, here I've got my color swatch. I will be trying to match with, as long as this is the right color, I'm going to be trying to match with that all over the model. So let's test on my finger, test on my palette. It's quite heavy, a lot's coming off there. Get rid of a bit of it and then take it to a highly textured area of the model, and I'm gently going to buff this up. Now it won't be immediately apparent that this is doing loads, but it is laying a foundation, and it is important that it's quite a heavy one. So again, we are moving way faster than you would do with any other technique other than airbrushing. This is a really good area to show exactly what this stage is helping us achieve. So completely coat everything, and it's worth probably in the same way that I went from one side of the model to the other with the washing, taking that approach on the model. So let's have a little look at this section where I made what's a fairly obvious mistake. We're just going to carry on working there until that's been buffed. It's a lot like airbrushing. So there we go, that was our huge mistake. Now barely seeable. We're going to be taking that approach all over the model. So anywhere where we've got hard pulling around these rivets and stuff like that towards the bottom of these sections, just going to be patient and we're going to buff it out. And we're doing that everywhere. Now it is important that you maintain the parts, you know, the parts that are meant to be slightly bluey. If you are doing something like this, which in this case is all of the model, make sure you don't forget and come back and just get the silver because you're used to doing that with highlighting. We are laying what we want to be a consistent base coat all over this model. If you need to jump to a smaller brush to get in the recesses, absolutely do that. It's important to get your decent coverage everywhere. This isn't meant to be dark and grim. It is meant to be pretty shiny overall. It is a grey night. Literally that was like, I don't know, 3 or 4 minutes work. Felt insanely quick. You know, by definition, I'm not trying to hit every recess for this, and it's not a wash. So yeah, it's been pretty forgiving. What I am going to do now is just take some more silver. You know, I've kept this palette, I've done the top and bottom at the same time. I'm going to take some silver, pop it in the middle, a tiny bit of blue. We do want this to contrast though. You know, it is important for us that this stands out I think what we'll be doing is we'll definitely jump to a clean brush for a final crisp silver. But for now, you'll notice, you know, less aggressive, further back, softer touch, still holding the miniature very firmly, but the idea is to have this pick out edges. So I'm going to be a little bit softer and more delicate with it. And this is going to go over the entire thing. So there is no black in this mix. I'm mixing it in the same place on my palette that I had our previous color, and there's obviously some paint left in my brush, but it's just a touch of the blue, mostly silver, and we're going to go over the entire thing with a soft touch, you know, buffing or whatever. At the point at which your brush gets much lighter, so there's less on it, you can go to your dampening palette, work off the recess in case it is a bit too wet, and then you can get more out of your brush like that. I'd really recommend that because it'll avoid getting heavy buildup. As it is, you know, we've done a lot of stages with one brush without specifically cleaning it, apart from cleaning as we go, so the cleaning as you go is all the more important. As a result of that, we're putting a lot of heavy pigment paints down. It makes sense to look after your tools. Okay, so after those stages, we have a beautifully, genuinely shiny miniature. That area where I said I'd been a bit rough has showed up the roughness a little bit, but not too much. I've just tried to be subtle with things. I think I could have maybe not been so hardcore with my stage after the wash. Maybe I could have been more selective with that, and rather than reflatting the panels, concentrated on the edges a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull some of that back with a little fast wash now, and it's going to be a much softer one. This will be a tinting wash, not like a go and grab the recesses and be bold and strong wash. I've got my mix. Don't expect to hear this repeated on the channel. Athematic blue is essential for this mix, and the reason this is essential is because it's got awful coverage, and it's slightly brighter than Drakenhof Nightshade. So I want something really soft for this kind of a soft touch, soft in its properties. If you have another blue that's a little bit lighter than Drakenhof that you'd like to use, go for it, but I am really down with how this looks, so let me demonstrate that. So now I can use this all over. You could of course pad this out with medium if you'd like it to be a bit more subtle. You can use this all over each section, and it's just going to tint them beautifully. Now the one I wanted before, I wanted to make sure my recesses were dark blue. This one we can pretty much go all over however we like. Now one thing to note, I've dropped down to size 4 for this, and that's because we've got loads of first time on the AO channels. I found that the 5, because of all of sections like this and the piping and stuff, I was ending up hitting other sections than the one that I wanted to by accident, and that is not too helpful with my wash in the previous step. So as this is closer towards the final stages of the model, I wanted to make sure that I was using something that I could be a little bit more delicate and controlled with, basically. So this mix is 50-50 of these two. As you can see, I've tested it on my texture palette instead of in my other palette this time, and that's because I wanted to see how it looked over the silver before I took it to the model. I might actually, for the larger sections, have a section over here where I pad it out a bit more, get some Lamy and medium down there. So there, obviously, you know, you can see it on a textured surface that has been buffed up to pretty much exactly the same silver that we've got on our model. So there we go, on these larger sections, you know, I can always go back and mix between the two. I want that to be darker, or on the bottom to be darker. There's absolutely nothing wrong with using 2 versions of the same wash at once if you want to be able to keep things subtle, which I do because, as I said, it's closer to final stage. So I'm going to rock this down over every single bit of the model. I know I've said I've got quite a few stages which go all over. It's very easy, and we've already suffered from it in this paint job, especially when you're looking on a larger model, just to think, oh, well, you know, I'm dry brushing, it should be the fastest thing in the world. It's going to be faster than everything that's not an airbrush anyway. So don't stress, you know, if you're having to do a few stages all over, as long as those stages are worth it, then nothing to complain about. I mean, look at that shading we're getting there, gorgeous. So this is going to go all over. I will be using more of the soft mix on the larger panels, and then I will be jumping to the slightly more powerful one on, you know, sections like this that have got harsh contrasting details and smaller details, basically. More contrast, more depth, more troughs, more peaks, that type of stuff. The big flat ones will use the subtleness. After that wash has dried, we've definitely tinted ourselves in the direction that I was hoping that we would get. Fairly subtle, a couple of areas of little mislips, but exactly the same as the previous process, we can do that. I'm going to be soft touching this dry brush. I have changed to a new non-contaminated brush, and we're going to be taking a very delicate approach for this. Just pure silver, test it on the palette, which is now pretty much been entirely dry brushed silver. We don't want to obscure that blue that we've put down, we're just trying to leave it there, tinting, doing its job and catch the edges. So big fat brush, extra large, small amount of very potent paint on there, and then going over the entire thing. And that is exactly the type of effect that we're looking for. So this will only literally take like 2 minutes. I will coat the entire thing, and areas that have had little slips on, I might have to do some selecting, fixing on, but aside from that, it's all going to be dry brushing in exactly this manner. I have a mix of Cassandora Yellow and Eandon Dark Sun here. They're both practically the same color. I prefer the mix though for their properties, and I'm using this to super efficiently go over my gold sections like that. So I'm trying to keep it to the raised sections. If I get it in the recesses though, it doesn't matter because I can just fix that with a wash. It's quite a forgiving technique, and it's a great way to turn silver things gold. So if we check out the weapon here, hopefully you should see what I'm on about. You can use a smaller brush than I'm using if you feel that helps with your control, but yeah, pretty cheaty. So you can absolutely, after this, give it another silver dry brush just to catch the edges. If you want, make sure you let it fully dry though. This mix does have quite a slow drying time. You are not looking to pull this anywhere. You're using this completely as a filter, as a glaze. So, you know, that is meant to be very, very thin. It's just going over it and changing the color like you're in Photoshop. You're not trying to use physical properties of pooling or anything like that. But it is sheer magic, and it is extremely efficient. In case you're wondering how detailed you can be with this, I'm using a big fat brush here. It is still the size 4. Because this is a potent mix, you will not be able to achieve this if you try and do it using a weak color. You can just carefully glaze over the top and think of this action that you're doing here as edge highlighting. You're edge highlighting a small flat section. You don't want to get it in the recesses, but the mix is so strong that you can quite easily, it's almost like buffing it, but do not try and follow the details. Like if this edge is here, I'm not going to try and go like, I am sideways on, and I'm always trying to just hit it, not ever with the very tip of my brush. I'm not trying to draw, I'm trying to carefully catch it with, even if it's close to the tip, I'm using the side of the brush. And that's really helpful and will help you have a wonderful control, even though you're using something that's wet that would pull into the recesses. The other thing is this brush is not overly saturated. You could see I was even getting a little bit of tip drying as a result. So even though the wash is very wet, take loads and then remove quite a lot. And that should leave you at a point where you can do this. If it's misbehaving, you've probably got too much on your brush, just go and remove some more and then come back and try again. And you should have it at a stage where if you brush it on your nail, it pretty much dries in like a second. There you go. You can do 2 passes of this, 3 passes of this if you need to. But again, it's a super strong mix. It'll do quite a good job pretty fast and quite efficiently. Okay, in all honesty, I'm quite scared about this, but I'd like to carry on trying to do as much as I can using tinting. So I've got a bit of Blood Angels red here, and then what I've done is I've mixed it with a little bit of Lamium medium and just some Caribou Crimson to kind of bulk it out and soften it a little. I'm gonna test this on my palette. I'm gonna put a little more of Lamium medium in there. Now, just for you guys, I will not be using my brush for this because obviously this is a potent mix. And these colors are nut strong. So even I'm not gonna risk contaminating my, my Lamium medium with them. Right, that seems to be behaving a little better. I'm using the 4, I'm not gonna use the 5 for this. I need a greater degree of control. And then let's see, you know, this type of stuff's worrying. We've put a lot of work in. The top can be darker. If it doesn't work, the top can be darker. Okay, so if anything, that looks like it may be potentially a little bit soft and washed out. We can always do this with 2 steps, but you know, I've committed now. Let's see if we can tint this in the same manner as we've tinted the gold. It might end up looking a bit too washed out. If that's the case, you know, we can always just base coat it red and go from there, as long as we don't do any of these stages too thick. And we're not aiming to do them too thick anyway, so that should not be a worry. All right, we'll give this 1 coat, we'll let it dry, and then we'll give it a second. The first coat doesn't look awesome, but as you can see here on this bit where I've just doubled up on the layering, the moment we've got a second layer on there, it definitely looks significantly deeper, a bit more legit. So I'm just gonna head over every single part of this with a second coat. I am using exactly the same method that I've been using everywhere on the model to help distinguish between the pistons, or the casing for the pistons. It's just a mix of Nuln Oil, and you could use Drac and Half like I have, or there's just a hint of that in there to stop it from being completely black. A couple of washes there. As you build them up, they will look superior. And the other thing I'm doing while I've got the mix on, and again, you know, if you've got the right amount on your brush and your brush has a good point, you don't need to step down in size for this. In order to make this gold stand out all the more, I'm just filling in the recesses. So this is why I didn't have to be too careful with the yellow, because I'm doing this, and this stuff is naturally going to want to pull in the recesses, not sit on top, as long as I'm fairly careful. If you're worried, you can always use a smaller brush, but you know, let's let the model do the work for us. And putting that black background in really makes that gold stand out. So super effective there. I've dotted around the model, filling in other details. We're beginning to look a lot more cohesive now, and I just have to figure out what I'm going to do as far as final detailing or potentially a base go. I'm just going to put a few little green stuff details on. This is the middle section that you cut out of green stuff, or hope that you guys are cutting out of green stuff. This little tail you can see here, you should never be using that for fancy sculpting because it's got dry bits in, because the two epoxies have touched each other and started curing. So I use that stuff for basing, and you know, you don't have to be as precise about, so pop it down, smooth it out with the thumb. I will smooth these mounds out with a tool, but just a couple of lumps there really adds a great degree of visual interest. And when I am dry brushing the texture that I put down on it, because obviously I will be dry brushing, it makes a really big difference to have some stuff there that's not completely uniform. Finishing dry brushing stages, this one's going to have to be extremely careful. So what I'm planning on doing is using the softest dry brush ever to just pick out and buff the edges of the sections that I have washed. Now obviously I'm just using silver here, so this is going to homogenize things a bit. It's going to pull them together, but you don't want it to pull them together too much. So these darker struts here, you can see I've already tested on these ones. I'll show you how little you are planning to catch these and how soft a touch you need. Holding it way back as normal if I am trying to be delicate. And then we just want it to clip those edges. There we go, look at that. Perfect. Beautiful texture on those. Really, really, really nice. The smokestacks, all the areas that I've hit with my darker wash, and as I work the paint off the brush and haven't had, you know, less and less on there, I can proceed with less caution, or I can take it to areas like the red that I'm a little bit worried about and buff those up fairly carefully out without needing to worry. There we go. And suddenly all these areas, you know, we've got a little bit of variation in there, but it's all kind of the same theme, begin to really make sense. I have masked off my blade. This is exactly the same colors and method that we use in our recent power weapon tutorial, so do feel free to check that out. I'm going to rock it through. I might try a hybrid where I use the airbrush a bit to try and save some time. Not too sure, but yeah, let's see how it goes. We have rushed this, and it is an unfortunate result of trying to get things out for deadline. You know, we've all been there, even got the shaky hands and stuff, but I am pretty pleased with how that's gone overall. He says, looking at one side, let's turn it over. yeah, we're okay. That's solid. So, you know, I could glaze that, but I think actually that result is really solid. It's very easy, especially when the masking tape's down and, you know, you're concentrating on it and you can only see the little patches where it hasn't quite perfectly worked to worry about something being wrong made of masking tape. But overall, I'm really pleased with that. And we are done. So to check out the boy himself again, turned out pretty nicely. Do let me know how you would finish this off. You know, would you take the weathering from the base up the legs? I often do that. Would you edge highlight the weapon? Cannot make my mind up at all. Normally I don't sit on the fence about stuff, but for the life of me I can't decide, so I didn't. To give proper credit where it is due, this basing method is taken completely, pretty much, apart from missing out some of the dry paints for the finishing, from Dan Osborne on Instagram. Check him out, he's a wicked painter of 40k and fantasy, but particularly of 40k. I think his methods are pretty interesting. Really enjoy doing that. I will be using that on future stuff, and I love the depth that we've got. Nice contrast when you've got like a pretty much down the line, clean model to give it a really dirty, you know, base with a lot of depth and some nuance in there from that Agrax and the Druchii Violet. Anyway, model turned out really well, super pleased with it. This was absolutely kind of an army painting method. Even though there's a lot of steps that I've covered thoroughly, it doesn't take too long, and if you're doing 3 of these at once, you would be doing them insanely quick overall. Alright, thank you very much. All suggestions, pop them below. If you've liked the video, please do like it, please comment, please subscribe, hit that bell notification to be notified for future content, and we will catch you in the next video.